Margaret Johnson, a 62-year-old black woman, had lived her entire life in the quiet town of Elmswood. Everyone in the community knew her as Grandma Maggie, a warm, gentle soul who often baked cookies for her neighbors and shared stories about her youth. She loved her community despite the lingering shadows of prejudice that often hovered over its streets. One afternoon, Margaret decided to run a simple errand to the grocery store. She never imagined how that day would change her life forever. As Margaret walked to the store, her knees aching slightly from arthritis, she noticed a commotion near the park. Two police officers were questioning a young black man who appeared nervous. Margaret's heart sank. She had seen situations like this before. She quietly walked past, hoping nothing would escalate. But as she rounded the corner, she heard raised voices and a sharp cry. Against her better judgment, Margaret turned back, driven by her sense of justice. She approached cautiously, watching as one officer grabbed the young man's arm forcefully. "Please, sir, I didn't do anything," the young man pleaded. Margaret's voice broke through the tension. "Officers, is everything all right?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. The two officers turned to her, their expressions hardening. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," one of them snapped. "But he's just a kid," Margaret said, her eyes filled with concern. "What has he done to deserve this treatment?" The officers exchanged a look before one of them stepped closer to Margaret. "Ma'am, I said this doesn't concern you." "Step back." Margaret stood her ground, her frail figure seemingly unshaken by the officer's imposing stance. "I'm not interfering," she said. "I'm just making sure no one gets hurt." Her words seemed to strike a nerve. "You're obstructing justice," the officer declared, his voice rising. "I'm just watching," Margaret insisted, her voice steady. The situation spiraled quickly. The officer grabbed Margaret's arm. "You need to leave now," he shouted. Margaret flinched but didn't resist. "Why are you treating me like this? I've done nothing wrong." Another officer stepped in, but instead of de-escalating, he shoved Margaret back. She stumbled but managed to keep her balance. "What's wrong with you people?" she exclaimed, her voice filled with a mix of fear and anger. "You can't treat people like this." That seemed to be the breaking point. The officer nearest to Margaret suddenly lashed out, shoving her harder this time. She fell to the ground, scraping her palms on the rough pavement. "Stay down, lady," the officer barked. Gasps erupted from bystanders who had gathered around the scene. Someone yelled, "What are you doing? She's an old woman." Margaret struggled to get up, her dignity more bruised than her body. "This is wrong," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. The young man, still in handcuffs, shouted, "Leave her alone. She didn't do anything." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "It's okay, son," she said softly. "I've dealt with worse, but it wasn't okay." What happened next would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. One officer, seemingly frustrated by the growing crowd, stepped forward and punched her in the shoulder. Margaret cried out in pain, collapsing back onto the pavement. The crowd erupted in outrage, with people pulling out their phones to record the incident. "You can't do that," a woman screamed. "She's a grandmother." The officer who had struck Margaret seemed to realize his mistake, but instead of apologizing, he barked orders to the crowd. "Move along. This is police business." Margaret lay there, clutching her arm, tears streaming down her face. Eventually, an ambulance was called, not by the officers, but by a concerned bystander. Margaret was taken to the hospital, where she was treated for a bruised shoulder and minor injuries. The incident quickly went viral, with footage of the officer punching Margaret spreading across social media. Outrage poured in from all corners of the country, with people demanding justice for Margaret and an end to police brutality. Margaret, however, remained quiet in the aftermath. "I didn't want this attention," she said during an interview. "I just wanted to make sure that boy was safe." Despite her reluctance, community leaders rallied around her, organizing protests and calling for accountability. Margaret's quiet resilience became a symbol of strength in the face of injustice. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but for Margaret, the scars went beyond the physical. "I've lived through decades of discrimination," she said, her voice weary but firm. "But I never thought I'd experience this at my age." Margaret's story became a catalyst for change in Elmswood, sparking conversations about racism and police brutality. The young men she had tried to protect visited her often, thanking her for her bravery. "I wasn't brave," Margaret said with a soft smile. "I was just doing what was right." Though the journey toward justice was long and uncertain, Margaret's courage inspired countless others to stand up against injustice, proving that even the smallest voices can spark a movement for change.